This tutorial is for 5th grade, Module 4, Lesson 17. In this lesson, we're going to use the hundreds grid to multiply fractions and then see how that relates to multiplying decimals. The directions for the first problem say to multiply and model. We're going to rewrite each expression as a multiplication sentence with decimal factors. So we're starting with the fractions 4/10 times 3/10. I'm going to look at that as 4/10 of 3/10. On my hundreds grid, I have shaded in 1/10. So one column is 1/10 of the entire grid. If I'm going to take 4/10 of 3/10, I need to shade in 3 of those columns. That would represent 3/10 of the entire grid. So I'll go ahead and shade in 2 more of the columns. So these 3 columns represent 3/10. Now I need to take 4/10 of those 3 columns. Well, on the 100 grid, each row also represents a tenth. So I'm going to start at the bottom and I'm going to represent these 4 rows as 4/10. So here's 4/10 of the entire grid. The answer to my question is the section where the 4/10 and the 3/10 overlap. And you can see that there are 12 pieces in that section. Each one of the pieces is 1/100th of the entire grid, since it takes 100 of these squares to make the entire grid. That means that 4/10 times 3/10 equals 12 1/100ths, 12 squares out of the 100 that make up the whole. To write that using decimal factors, I would change each fraction to a decimal first. 4/10 as a decimal is 0.4. Take that times 3/10, and my product is 12/100ths. That would be 0.12 as 12/100ths. So this is the decimal form of this multiplication problem. The next problem is 1/10 times 4/10. And the first thing I'm going to do is change it so both factors are fractions. So we'll say it's 1/10 of 4/10. And I've started by shading in the 4 columns that represent the 4/10. Now I just need to take 1/10 of that. Well, 1/10 is 1 row, so we're going to look at this 1 row at the bottom, and that's my 1/10. So 1/10 goes all the way across, but 1/10 of the 4/10 is just this bottom section, the 4 squares in the bottom corner. And those 4 squares would be 4 1/100ths, because it takes 100 squares to make the entire grid. To write that in decimal form, we'll say that 1/10 times 4/10 equals 4/100ths. The 100th spot being my second spot past the decimal. So 1/10 times 4/10 equals 4/100ths. The next question is 6/10 times 7/10. And again, I'm going to start by writing it as a fraction times a fraction. So we'll have 6/10 times 7/10. And I've shaded in the 7/10, or the 7 columns, on the 100 grid. So there's my 7/10. And now I need to take 6/10 of that. So I just need to count out 6 rows. This would represent the 6/10. This section right here is 6/10 of the whole. Where the 2 overlap would be my product. So I have 6 rows of 7, which would be 42 pieces, and each piece is a 100th. In decimal form, I would write 6/10 times 7/10 equals 42 hundredths. In the next section, we're going to use our understanding of fraction multiplication to help us multiply decimals. The first problem is 5 times 7/10. We've rewritten it as 5 times 7/10 as a fraction. And if you remember back to multiplying fractions, 5 times 7/10 means I have 5 copies of 7/10. My denominator is not going to change when I do this multiplication. I'm just taking 5 groups of 7/10. So the tenths is going to stay the same. Well, if I have 5 groups of 7, that would give me 35 pieces, and each piece is still a tenth. 35 tenths, written in decimal form, is 3 wholes and 5 tenths, because in 35 tenths, it would take 30 tenths to make 3 wholes, and that would leave 5 tenths. So that's where we get 3 and 5 tenths in decimal form. So the answer to 5 times 7/10 is 3 and 5 tenths. The next problem is 5 tenths times 7/10. We've written it in fraction form, and then again we're going to show that we're taking our numerators times our numerators and our denominators times our denominators, like we did when we were multiplying fractions. So 5 times 7 is 35. 10 times 10 is 100. So 5 tenths times 7 tenths is 35 hundredths. To write that in decimal form, I would write 0.35. Since the 5 is in the hundredth spot, my answer needs to land in the hundredth spot. So 5 tenths times 7 tenths is 35 hundredths. And in the next question, we're multiplying 5 hundredths times 7 tenths. So I'm going to take my 5 times my 7, numerator times numerator, and my 100 times my 10 to show denominator times denominator. That leaves me with 35 thousandths. And as a decimal, I need to get that 35 into the thousandths place. So that's the third place over. 5 hundredths times 7 tenths is 35 thousandths. And in the last section, we're going to follow the same steps that we just used, only now we have to write each of those steps. So the first problem is 6 times 3/10, and the first step is to write it as a fraction. So I'm going to write 6 times 3/10. And that means we're going to take 6 times 3, and that answer shows me how many tenths I have. Well, 6 times 3 is 18, so 18 tenths is a product. As a decimal, that would be 1 and 8 tenths, because 18 tenths is the same as 10 tenths and 8 tenths. 10 tenths is my 1 whole, and 8 tenths is the first place to the right of the decimal point. So 6 times 3/10 is 1 and 8 tenths. In the next problem, we're taking 6 tenths times 3/10. That would be 6 tenths times 3/10 as a fraction, or 6 times 3 and 10 times 10, which would be 18 hundredths, and as a decimal, be 0.18. The 8 lands in the hundredths place. So 6 tenths times 3/10 is 18 hundredths. And the last question is 6 hundredths times 3/10. We'll write that as a fraction. 6 hundredths times 3/10, and I can look at that as 6 times 3 and 100 times 10. That would be 18 thousandths. And as a decimal, be 0.018. The 8 lands in the thousandths place. So 6 hundredths times 3 tenths is 18 thousandths.